Every year, the Electronic Entertainment Expo, or E3 as you're more likely to know it, is the highlight of the gaming calendar, both for those who make games and those who play them. This year's show is only weeks away, and it's promising to be bigger than ever before, with more press conferences, tons of new announcements, and surprise releases coming through the end of 2017. But how did E3 start, and how did it turn into the Super Bowl of the gaming industry? Well, to answer that, we have to go back to 1995, when the expo we all know and love first launched. And interestingly enough, the history of how it came about is rooted in the battle between Nintendo and Sega at the height of their rivalry, and a bit of trouble the two landed themselves in with the federal government. Yeah, it's kind of a wild ride, but first, the basics and some context. E3 was an effort by the Interactive Digital Software Association, now called the Entertainment Software Association, to give video games their own trade event. Prior to E3, there was no big gaming expo solely dedicated to video games. In the mid-90s, the home console business was only about a $3 billion industry, so video games got lumped in with every other form of electronics at the Consumer Electronics Show, CES, which happened every year in Chicago and Las Vegas. At the time, video games were kind of the stepkid of the show. The CES organizers didn't really know what to do with video game companies, sometimes stuffing dozens of them under an off-site tent, even when it was snowing, or sticking them somewhere near the pornography booths. But generally, CES is where the industry showed up to make big announcements, and where Sega and Nintendo did a lot of their battling for supremacy for the home console market. Back in 1990, Nintendo owned about 90% of the marketplace, but Sega stole a lot of it back in the years leading up to the first E3 in 1995, fighting its way to just over half of the market share. As part of Sega's march to steal territory from the giant that was Nintendo, they started positioning themselves as the older, cooler brother to Nintendo's kid-friendly console in the early 90s. This led to much edgier marketing. Quite a few of us remember those very shouty Sega ads, and a more teen-friendly mascot in Sonic the Hedgehog. However, this positioning also led to some controversial decisions for a handful of video games on Sega consoles. For one, Sega's adoption of blood into the console version of Mortal Kombat. Nintendo censored the SNES version, resulting in a massive hit to sales. And Night Trap, the Sega CD FMV game, which featured scenes showing assault against women. Never mind that you were supposed to be preventing that violence, but sometimes those finer points are lost when scantily clad women and vampires are on screen. All of this resulted in some major heat from the US government, which took issue with kids' access to the gratuitous violence in each of these games, and in plenty of others. In 1993, the video game industry was put under the microscope in a Senate hearing where congressmen grilled both Nintendo and Sega. And oh boy, there was some major courtroom drama there. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, Nintendo's Perrin Kaplan sent out several hundred VHS tapes to legislators all over DC, filled with the most graphic scenes from Sega's Night Trap, just so they know who to blame for the whole mess. And during the actual hearing, Sega's Bill White reportedly resorted to bringing out Nintendo's Super Scope as a product without an age rating as evidence of Nintendo's lack of responsibility. Ouch! Only he accidentally referred to it as a Sega product. Double ouch. Throughout the ordeal, the Nintendo and Sega representatives argued in favor of their own companies. Nintendo attacked Sega for its non-kid-friendly games, while Sega argued that it actually did have a rating system in place, while Nintendo had no rating system at all, declaring all Nintendo games acceptable for all audiences. Because, you see, Sega had tried to get out ahead of this problem by establishing their own ratings board, the Video Game Ratings Council, which rated Sega games based on their maturity and content. Seeing the Senate hearing coming from a mile away, Sega tried to convince Nintendo and others to adopt the VRC, but Nintendo refused. Mostly because the overriding sentiment was that Sega was the one ruining things for everybody, and Sega would ultimately be the ones punished by the Senate hearings. But unfortunately for everyone else, that wasn't the case. After the hearing, Senator Joe Lieberman called for the Video Games Rating Act of 1994, and the message was loud and clear. If the video game industry didn't get its shit together and create their own regulatory body, the US government was going to do it for them. As you can imagine, nobody wanted that scenario. Sega, Nintendo, Acclaim, Electronics Arts, and others eventually worked out a compromise during a series of backroom meetings at the following winter CES, and rather than adopting Sega's VRC, they elected to form the Interactive Digital Software Association, which would represent the entire industry. In 1994, the IDSA went back to Congress to present the Entertainment Software Rating Board, or the ESRB, which is still in place today to rate video games based on content. So, how does all of this tie into CES and E3? Well, now that the industry had its own trade group and had a huge problem with its second-class citizen status at CES, the IDSA decided that video games were such a huge, growing market, it needed its own trade show. Hence, the creation of the Electronic Entertainment Expo, the first of its kind solely dedicated to gaming. But not everybody was on board for the first E3, and even support for the show itself became a dick measuring contest, once again between Sega and Nintendo. Nintendo, ever the loyalist and put off by E3 since Sega had helped to lead the creation of the IDSA, declared it would still bring its products to CES, while Sega announced support for E3 immediately. Eventually, Nintendo had to concede this small victory to Sega and reluctantly joined up as well, once a number of other major developers threw their lots in with the E3 over CES. So, rather interestingly, this made the first E3 already massive right out of the gate. The first show had 50,000 attendees, which is actually right about the same attendance as E3 2016, and it might have faded a little after that if it weren't for the first year having some of the most famous moments in E3 history. Nintendo's debut of the Virtual Boy, the price point of the Sony PlayStation, and unfortunately for Sega, an ill-advised decision that started their decline. The months leading into E3 hadn't gone particularly well for the company. The recently launched 32X was a dud from the word go, Nintendo had seen massive success with the release of Donkey Kong Country, and Sony was poised to debut the PlayStation, which Sega of America had originally tried to develop alongside them. To kick off the festivities at E3 1995, Sega dropped the bombshell announcement that the Sega Saturn was coming out that week at select retailers, well ahead of the previously scheduled September launch date, and it would be priced at $399. Sony followed up with their own press conference about the PlayStation, to which SCEA President Steve Race gave one of the shortest and most memorable E3 speeches of all time. $299. All of these factors helped cement E3 as a huge success in its very first year, because for the first time, this was major proof that video games had grown up, and that they didn't need to be set aside in a tent at CES anymore. And fortunately for all of us, the show has continued throughout the years with more thrilling stories and colossal disappointments ever since. So what do you guys think of the history of how E3 started? What are some of your favorite E3 moments? What are some of your favorite E3 fails? Let us know in the comments. And if you want to know more about this period in video game history, quite a bit of the information here is available in more detail in Blake Harris's book, The Console Wars. And if you're new around here and you want more informative videos about video game industry and video games in general, why not like this video and subscribe to the know?